It's a working library. It's a library stuffed full of books from all the way around the world. And all these books, each of the books in this library, are written by someone who's been forced into exile. Language is migratory. It's diasporic. It moves across countries all the time. And written into the walls is this extraordinary, deep history of the destroyed libraries of the world. So when you've written your name in a book in this library, you know that next year this book will be in a library in Mosul. So it's a history of exile. But more than that, it's a celebration of an extraordinary world of people who've had to move, migrate across borders.
Good afternoon. I'm Hartwig Fischer, Director of the British Museum. At the start of March, the museum opened its latest exhibition, Library of Exile, by acclaimed potter, artist, writer Edmund de Waal. Made of walls covered in white liquid porcelain and inscriptions on the outside and inside, filled with books by almost 1,500 writers from 58 countries and in dozens of languages, the library was conceived as a place of contemplation and dialogue about exile. It explores the critical issue of what it means to have to move to another country, to speak another language, to be unhomed. A few days after its opening, lockdown was announced and the library was forced to close, along with the rest of the British Museum, for the longest peacetime closure in its entire 260-year history. After almost 6 months, however, the museum has finally reopened its doors and the library is receiving readers once again. Come and visit soon, for next year, its books will be donated to the University of Mosul in Iraq after its own library was burned to the ground in 2015 by ISIS, with the loss of over 1 million books and invaluable manuscripts, the destruction of yet another library and all that it offers to so many people. Today's discussion, Writing the Experiences of Migration and Exile, is presented in partnership with English Pen. Chaired by Edmund himself, it features novelist and human rights activist Elif Shafak, writer and journalist Hamid Ismailov, and journalist, broadcaster and writer Kavita Puri. It is the first in a series of events exploring themes and issues raised by the Library of Exile. We are indebted to our sponsor, the AKO Foundation, whose generosity and vision has made this program possible, as well as the installation itself. And so, without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to welcome my friend Edmund and our esteemed guests. Edmund, over to you.
Thank you, and the warmest of welcomes this evening to a marvelous event where I'm going to be sharing a conversation with 3 extraordinary people, 3 people who I would choose to be locked up in a library with. The 3 people who are in conversation with me this afternoon are Kavita Puri, an award-winning broadcaster, an extraordinary journalist whose landmark series, Partition Voices, brought the experiences of partition in India, Pakistan, to extraordinary life. It's a compelling book, and it has reset, in many ways, the conversations around silence and memory for communities right across this country and across the world. I'm joined also by Hamid Ismailov, the poet, the novelist, a man of great courage, exiled from Uzbekistan since 1992. We'll be hearing from him about what it is not to be read in your own country. He is a remarkable novelist and someone with a compelling ability to bring poetry and narrative together. He stands really internationally as one of the great voices in our complicated world. And finally, I welcome Elif Shafak, the novelist, the human rights campaigner, the fierce and wonderful polymath who has brought throughout her novels and her non-fiction the experiences of those voiceless, the issues of gender, of politics, of identity into compelling storytelling. So 3 remarkable people, all of whom bring from their own places many different stories, many different experiences of knowledge that I want to hear from. I'm Edmund, I'm a potter, I'm a writer, and by default, by accident, I seem to become a librarian. So there you go, I am the librarian for tonight. But Kavita, may I ask you first a simple and deep question, which is, where are you from?
Where are you from? Well, I have a short answer and a long answer. Which do you want, Edmund?
I want the best answer, please.
Well, I suppose the beginning of the long answer is Kent. And if I'm giving the short answer to that very loaded question, that's what I say. But obviously it's much deeper than that. I was born in Britain, in Kent. I spent my whole life in this country. I understand Britain. I understand its ways. I understand the many layers of that question, where are you from? But my parents came from India, and so I feel an attachment to India, of course. And my dad, who was the inspiration of my book, was from Lahore originally, Lahore when it was part of British India. And it would in 1947 become part of Pakistan. And he, like many millions of Hindus, had to cross the border into India. And so I feel an attachment to Lahore, even though I have never been there. It is an inherited attachment. So I feel all those things in all its messiness. And I don't feel like I have to choose. I can dip into those worlds. I understand those different worlds. I quite like feeling part of them and not part of them. I really am. I feel like a citizen of nowhere and everywhere. But it's interesting, I live part of my life in Spain. No one ever asks me where I am from. And I feel the absence of that question. And it would be nice, perhaps, in time, if nobody really did ask that question in its loaded way. So that's the longish answer.
Kavita, that's marvelous. Can I ask messiness? Messiness is a word we might come back to, but between the 4 of us, I think perhaps we share messiness as our DNA. Elif, can I ask you next this loaded question? Answer it in any way, explore it, but where are you from?
Actually, I think this was the question that for a long time I dreaded being asked, I didn't want to be asked because I knew my answers were going to be long. And usually the people who would ask me this question, they didn't have time for long answers. You could only fit one word into that box. And I had a trouble with that. And the reason that I'm saying this is because, in a nutshell, I was born in France, in Strasbourg, to Turkish parents. After a while, my parents got separated. My father stayed in France, and my mother brought me to Turkey because for her, Turkey was motherland. Whereas for me, it was a new country, that I had to discover almost from scratch. And we came to my maternal grandmother's house From that moment onwards, I was raised by 2 women. And after I was 10 years old, we moved to Spain. I spent some time in Jordan, in Germany, Cologne, back to Ankara. In my early 20s, I came to Istanbul on my own. I fell in love with Istanbul. And I think Istanbul is very visible in my work. I lived long years in Istanbul, but also I think there were times when I felt suffocated. So I went to Boston, then I went to Michigan, then I went to Arizona. In these places, I wrote different books. Then I came back to Istanbul. And a while ago, more than 12 years ago now, I moved to the UK and I became a Londoner and I became very attached to this country. So when I look at my own journey, I think I see multiple belongings, multiple layers. And I want to fight for that multiplicity in a world that doesn't appreciate multiplicity and more puts us into boxes. Of course, I'm an Istanbulite, and I think Istanbul is very visible. It will come with me wherever I go in my life. It's always there. But I also feel very attached to the Balkans. There are elements in my soul from the Middle East. At the same time, I'm a European by birth. The values that I share, I uphold. I have become a British citizen, and despite what politicians have been telling us, I would like to call myself a citizen of the world, a citizen of humanity. And that doesn't mean you're floating in the air aimlessly, that you have no attachments, just the opposite. It means you can care about multiple things at the same time.
That's a marvelous answer, and again, a marvelously compelling way to open things up into belonging, which we must talk about. And also, of course, the anxieties which happen increasingly about being policed about our identities, of being told that we can only have one singular identity. And that, Hamid, where are you from? This is a question profoundly for you at this moment.
Presenting, the panel, you yourself said that I'm from Uzbekistan, but Uzbekistan is a country which sort of doesn't allow my books to be read. Uzbekistan is the place where I wasn't born. So continuing what Elif Hanum said, when I was young and used to write poetry, once I wrote in Uzbek something like that. Men yolumdan adashib, bu jahanga kelibman. Going astray, I found myself in this world. Basically, it's about the perceptions in a way. So my wife, for example, wherever he appears, he as a beautiful lady, he is considered one of us. In Italy, everyone considers that she is an Italian. In Czech Republic, everyone considers that she is Czech. In China, everyone considers that she is Chinese. But as for me, even in Uzbekistan, people, I do remember, were addressing, ask this bearded Korean, what time is it now, So I don't belong to any place in a way. I am a foreigner everywhere in a way. Whereas my wife is a sort of one of us in any place. So, and psychology of it is like that, I'm going nomadic sort of type of psychology. My wife is more sedentary. And when you're asking, for example, where you're from, I can name once again hundreds of places. Now I'm sitting in Marienbad, in Czech Republic. So tomorrow I'll be in Prague, in Kafka City. So everywhere I'm a stranger in a way. But at the same time, I would fight anyone who considers to own a certain place, because owning a place in this world is, in the best case, it's an illusion. In the worst case, it's a prejudice. And we as writers, wandering between prejudice and illusion.
Okay, so owning a place, I mean, what I would love to hear from is whether or not, in some ways, you have experienced exile. I mean, Elif, there you are, nomadic, as you say, from France into all this wonderful plurality of places. and a plurality also of languages. You write in several languages, I know. Do you experience exile in any kind of way, or is that something that is a projection from your readers, or indeed from me, onto you? How does exile work within you as a person, as a writer?
Exile is a difficult word. It's a word that I think about a lot in its different dimensions, because there are different forms of exile. Sometimes there's self-imposed exile, which is not an easy thing to talk about. And then there's exile that's being imposed on you by the circumstances outside, and these two can also coexist. So yes, it's a word that I would use for my own experience, definitely. I do not go back to Turkey anymore. I don't want to talk about this so much because so many people are suffering in so many different ways. It feels wrong to try to talk about personal experiences, but it pains me. It's a wound in my soul that I cannot go to Istanbul. And that Turkey has become a very difficult place, to put it more bluntly, for writers, for journalists, for academics, for poets, for cartoonists. Anyone who is dealing with art, with words, I think is finding it very difficult. So that's what we've been experiencing in Turkey. More and more we've been going backwards. So not to be able to go back is emotionally is heavy. And that doesn't mean that you are not there in your heart. It doesn't mean that you are disconnected, just the opposite. It's a very fragmented, nomadic experience. So exile is a word that I care about and I read about a lot.
I mean, Elif, you're hugely read, of course, in Turkey. I mean, you are a considerable voice there. And so that connection to the place that you cannot go, you are still there absolutely through your writing. And Hamid, Uzbekistan, I mean, you are not allowed to be published in that country. And yet you have found ways, more latterly with your extraordinary latest novel, to be published in that country. Can you talk to us about how that's happening, and also this extraordinary reality for you that though you are by far the best known writer in the country, you are not allowed to be talked about, you are banned, your works cannot be published?
I wouldn't sort of, overestimate all of these experiences which I lived through, because it's not for the first time and not, unfortunately, for the last time it's happening in this world. I mean, take generally the idea of the sort of refuge, of the exile. Look at the sort of, at the world religions. One of the biggest books of sort of, of Torah is Exodus. Islam is based on Hijrah, for example. Once again, it's about the Exodus. So take all the concepts of mystical life, like Tao, for example, which stands for the way, or Sufism, for example, Tariqat, for example, which stands for the way. All of that is saying that it's a human condition. Basically, moving from place to place is a human condition. In that sense, yeah, it's all right. I'm living in the Uzbek literature or in Uzbek language, but at the same time, I'm writing as a Russian writer, my Russian books. I started to write as an English, sort of as a British writer, my British books. There are always two ways, sort of, two strategies of a writer. One is of Nabokov strategy to adapt you to a new place, to a new language, to a new values. And there is Solzhenitsyn type, you know, when you are sort of sticking to your own shoes all your life, you know. And it's so symbolic that, for example, Solzhenitsyn lived in Vermont in a fenced sort of estate like a castle, whereas Nabokov ended his life in a Montrose hotel, you know. So there are different strategies of approaching this world as a writer.
Well, okay, that's a marvelous dichotomy between those two, the fenced in and a more liberated view. But I mean, it's interesting because, of course, that brings us back to a central thing, which is that there is a plurality of you know, we don't want to homogenize the experience in any way of exilic literature, of exile literature. That would be a pernicious and inappropriate thing to do. I mean, what I would want to explore, though, and Kavita, perhaps you could talk about this, is the fact that of migration, which is, as Hamid has eloquently said, in every single Abrahamic religion, there is Exodus, there is the Psalms, part of every single Abrahamic tradition. Migration, this idea that we have had to move, not from choice, but we've had to move because of terrible conditions that have been forced upon us. We carry with us something. We can then choose either to communicate that or to keep silent. Now, your experience, profound experience of your father, is about migration and silence. And I would love to hear more about that.
Well, as you say, exile happens for so many reasons: war, persecution, famine, natural disasters, climate change now. But the migration that I documented in first-person testimony was that of those people who lived through the partition of India. And it was the largest migration outside war and famine that the world has ever seen. And British India was divided, and Hindus and Sikhs went to India, Muslims went to Pakistan. It's estimated between 10 to 14 million people were on the move at any one time in opposite directions. And so people left their land that they had been on for generations and had to leave often very quickly to a new country, perhaps learn a new language, start from scratch all over again. And they were refugees. But then those whose lives had been so disrupted by partition chose to migrate to Britain. So as a refugee, you have no choice, but then you choose to migrate. And what happened was those many thousands of people that came to post-war Britain came to Britain with their stories of trauma and loss. But they kept them hidden away for so many decades. And it was only really with the 70th anniversary in 2017 that there was a public space for people to finally talk about what they had been through. And it was incredibly traumatic. It shapes the Indian subcontinent so profoundly. It still dictates national narratives on the Indian subcontinent. And I would say that for British South Asians, second generation like me and third generation, it really matters to know your history. Our tie to our land in Britain is fragile. It is one generation, perhaps two, and it's important that we know our history. But with the 70th anniversary, that silence was broken, and there were lots of really complicated reasons for that silence. Partly they were just trying to get on with their life, as so many refugees or migrants have to do. There's no time to look back on the past. You're in a sometimes really hostile environment. You just have to get on with your life. And then your children who are born in a new land, they know very little of home. And with partition, there is a lot of shame and dishonor bound up in partition memories. So for all those reasons, there was silence. And for me, the importance of documenting those stories, those testimonies, and writing them down was that if you don't document those stories, they are gone forever. And what you document is something very complex, which is, even if you have not been back to your land in 70 years, you have a very, very strong attachment. It might be the land where your mother is still buried in its earth. It might be the land that you want your ashes scattered when you're dead. Even if you haven't been there in 70 years, that feeling is incredibly profound, which is why I say I still have a connection. I feel a connection to the whole. It is purely inherited memory, but I have that. And so it can be very difficult, not just, memories of the Holocaust took decades to really come out. I think it's not unusual with trauma to take so long, so many decades to finally speak, but there has to be a public space too.
I think that's so true, and I think that there is a sort of safety around silence, that some people who have experienced profound trauma, and certainly true of the Holocaust era generation, I know this from my own family experience, that you don't want to pass on the stories simply because you don't want, in some way, to make your children carry something that you carry. But not saying something, not passing on a story, has consequences. It all has consequences which can be very profound, and that is for another time, perhaps. But what I'm also conscious of, and this is about migration, is that by not telling the story, you are making yourself English.
Yeah.
Or British, or whatever you want to do. You're saying, actually, all that happened, and now here I am, and my identity is rooted and grounded and particular and maybe singular in this particular country. So what I'm interested in with the four of us is that, of course, we're all talking, and Elif, perhaps you could talk a little bit more about this, about the multiplicity of identities. It's so present within your novels, and I have to say, if I can wave around your new book, which has just come out, How to Stay Sane in an Age of Division, it's beautifully adumbrated in this Buy It Now glorious book that came out 3 days ago. Tell me, talk to us, multiplicity.
I so appreciate Edmund. I think, following up on what Kavita was saying, it's so important to break those silences, because they affect everything and their impact goes on for generations. And I do sincerely believe, as storytellers, of course, we love stories, we chase stories, we love imagination, words, language, but we are also drawn to silences, and we must. So maybe there's a part of me that wants to give a bit more voice to people who have been forgotten, pushed to the periphery, to the margins. I think literature has to empower those who have been disempowered and make the invisible a bit more visible. So rather than focusing on the center, it is the margins, it is the periphery that pulls me towards itself. And when you pay attention to the periphery, you realize there are so many stories that have been erased, systematically forgotten, even within the same family. Turkey is a country, of course, with a very rich and long and complicated history, but that does not mean that we have a strong memory. Just the opposite, we are a society of collective amnesia. Our entire relationship with the past is full of ruptures, a big void, and that void is filled with either ultranationalist interpretations of history or Islamist interpretations of history, in which there are, of course, no nuances, and one single narrative is imposed from above, top down. So when you start asking questions about people, human beings, how would I feel about the Ottoman Empire, for instance, if I had been an Armenian silversmith? How would I feel if I had been a Jewish miller? How would I feel if I had been a concubine in the harem? If I had been a peasant in the Balkans? When you start asking these seemingly small but fundamentally important questions about human beings and their experiences, you realize that the narrative that we have been fed is not correct. And so it becomes very important to tell the story, to imagine the stories of minorities. To me, that is something that's very close to my heart. And I think overall what I like, especially in a novel, and I think a novel, the novel as a genre is one of our last remaining democratic spaces where we can still have nuanced approaches to big issues. In a novel, what I like is when you bring different writers together, how they challenge each other, how they coexist. That to me is amazingly important. I don't think it's the job of a writer to try to dictate anything, to try to preach or teach anything that is wrong. But I think it is the job of a writer to ask questions, including difficult questions about difficult issues, including questions about identity. And then once you create that open space with a diversity of opinions, you always leave the answer to the reader, because every reader's answer is going to be different, and we have to respect that. But storytelling opens up spaces, democratic, egalitarian spaces where there's diversity, inclusion, and where we can have cognitive flexibility to see the truth from the perspective of someone else. And I think that is an incredibly important intellectual exercise, but also almost like a spiritual exercise, which we need more and more in today's polarized world.
So, and Hamid, this takes us straight to you. I love this. I mean, it's in some ways what you're talking about there is the polyphonic nature of fiction. It's not a single voice. It's the ability to inhabit otherness and plurality, and also perhaps to allow change to happen, both temporally and geographically. And I'm so conscious, Hamid, about when I talk about polyphony, that not only do you write in several languages, but also your novels are full of poetry and full of other people and full of possibilities. And I think we might have lost him. We're looking at Hamid expectantly. I rather liked that thing about polyphony, but I don't think, unfortunately, Hamid is currently there in his hotel bedroom. But in his latest novel, The Devil's Dance.
Oh, he's back.
Oh, here he is.
He's back.
Hamid, talk to us. Hamid, polyphony, many voices.
I missed some part of the conversation. I'm sorry, because my telephone all of a sudden rebelled, you know. So, yeah, about polyphony, but what I sort of, gathered about the multiplicity and about the, literature is one of the best tools of breaking the sort of, prejudices, emptying the illusions or filling down the illusions. But at the same time, it's one of the tools of creating new prejudices, And what I mean, for example, the fundamental issue of of migration is always us against others. So basically, it's about otherness, isn't it? So, but otherness is quite sort of various in forms. It might be sexual otherness, it might be religious otherness, it might be racial otherness, you name it. So basically, we're talking about the otherness as a sort of, big concept when we're talking about migration and the issues of migrations. I'll take just one example, a very small example. In the Soviet Union, I used to read the books of the mainstream literature, and all of them, Russian novels were about Russians, Uzbek novels were about Uzbeks, Georgian novels were about Georgians, and so on and so forth. Take every great Russian writer of the 20th century, Bulgakov, Nabokov, or who else, Solzhenitsyn, all the novels are mono-national, mono-ethnical. I became infamous for sort of, introducing the Noah's Arch of the reality of the people, because our reality was, a mixture of all nations, races, beliefs, faiths, etc., etc. When I came to Britain, I'm reading the sort of mainstream British literature. It's also mostly mono-ethnic, mono-national. It's quite strange. I always laugh, even sort of, my revered and beloved colleague writer Kazuo Ishiguro, himself being Japanese, rarely admits any other nations into his novels, So that is a big problem for me, the reality which we are sort of, facing. When I look, for example, at my, let's say, cul-de-sac in Barnet, I see all the nations there, all the nations. But the reality of our books are mostly mononational. So it's a simple sort of, example, but that is the way where literature can bring something, to fight for otherness, to sort of, to make otherness much closer to us, much more acceptable.
Well, I mean, that's wonderful. And I mean, I wish we were all at this very moment in the Library of Exile, because I suppose the imperative of actually building this library, I mean, no one asks you to build a Library of Exile, was simply the feeling that when I looked at my shelves behind me here, and I scanned them, I realized that every second book on my shelves was someone who had started in one place and ended up in another. And that my whole reading life, my whole life is informed by people who have been forced to leave one home and make another. And what interested me was what they brought with them, and what they share, and what we can then share through translation. And I wanted to be in a space where quite obviously you could see what a world of migration looked like. Now, I think it's really compelling. I love the idea that people can go in and find a book in actually it's 90 different languages from different places in the world. But my question to all three of you is this a mistake? Am I homogenizing by having a Library of Exile the very particular singular experience of one writer and then another and another? Elif, have I got it wrong?
You haven't got it wrong at all. And I think this entire project is so important in so many different ways. We're living in a world in which books are disappearing, libraries are being raised down, but also a nuanced way of thinking is not being encouraged. Knowledge itself is being mixed with information, whereas there are different things. I think we're living in a world in which we are bombarded with information. We have way too much information, less knowledge, and even less wisdom. So to put the emphasis on knowledge and try to change that ratio and put the emphasis on wisdom and empathy and storytelling is incredibly important, because information is very different. It's something that we consume. It doesn't stay with us, and it makes us arrogant. It gives us the illusion that we know the subject, whereas knowledge is completely different. For knowledge, we need to slow down. We need to go within. We need a library for knowledge, right? We need books. We need literature. And then for wisdom, hopefully in the long run, we need to bring the mind and the heart together. We need empathy. We need emotional intelligence. So by putting the emphasis on knowledge and continuity and our loss of knowledge, but also the experiences of exile, belonging, non-belonging, I think you're opening up a very important conversation. perhaps the only thing I would add to this conversation at this stage is, especially in the last years, we have begun to see more and more people who don't necessarily leave their homes in terms of going elsewhere, but still are living in some kind of exile, in the sense that they cannot recognize their own countries anymore because of politics, because of divisions, because of tension. So they are kind of feeling some kind of exile, but maybe they don't have the words to express this. Whether you're in Brazil, in the Philippines, in Turkey, in Poland, in Hungary, I know many people who are familiar with the sense of estrangement from their own cultures or societies all of a sudden. And that, too, I think, is an important part of this discussion.
I think that's really interesting. And I mean, that idea that actually exile is not only this very particular and dreadful sense of a loss of a place, but actually being able, actually not seeing the country, not understanding the country which you're in because of the terrible political and social issues that allow you to be erased or effaced, don't allow your voice to be heard, is a very compelling issue here. I have questions that are beginning to come in. I have a list of questions that are coming in from our thousands of people who are hanging on your words. So can I, actually this is absolutely apropos of what we're talking about here. And perhaps I can ask you, Hamid, about this. This is from one of our viewers. Exile is so often romanticized in literature, but in reality it usually means blood, tears, and poverty. At the same time, it's wonderful to hear you talking about exile being a source of wisdom and inspiration, but is there a contradiction there? Does this bother you? Does this bother you, this idea of the wisdom, the inspiration, the generative power of exile, and the absolute dogged misery that often is entailed by the reality? Is
Yes,
that a
it comes
contradiction?
hand in hand, isn't it? The one side of the exile with the other side. The problem here for me is not so much, the exile as a problem, but the receiving side, that is the biggest problem of the receiving side. What I'm talking here is about the prejudices of the receiving side. When the receiving side treats others as completely sort of, strangers and foreigners on this earth, I said about the prejudice of owning the place, For example, I did my DNA test. I consider myself, 7 generations from Central Asia and so on and so forth. But I'll just read you several names and you guess the sort of ethnicities of these people. Svetlana Lisandro, Joshua Simpson, Levitsky Elina, Mustafa Bereket, Sara Skopazzi, Naoki Hayukava, Ruben Fuentes, Miamdama Chuhalansunda, Eva Strom, all of them, they are 5th generation or 4th generation cousins of mine. I consider myself owning Uzbekistan, but at the same time, I've got every nation in my genes, basically. Why I should own this place? That is the biggest problem for me. The receiving side rather than the exiles, we have to work not with the writers like us, for example, but we have to work with the mainstream writers on the same theme.
Kavita, I know you want to come in on this. Please steam in on this one, Kavita.
Well, no, it was really just about the purpose of your exhibition about the Library of Exiles. And I just think, honestly, there's never been a more important time. Look at the world that we're living in. More people on the move than we have seen before. Millions and millions of people, Syria, South Sudan, people risking their lives, that of their children, on flimsy dinghies coming to trying to get into Britain. And I think that what your library shows is that the experience of migration is long. It has always happened. It will carry on happening. And I'm like you. Every other one of my books behind me is a story of movement, of migration, of the diasporic experience. And it might not be my experience, but I take something from it. And I think that people who have that, the generation, the first or the second or third, who live betwixt worlds, who feel that dislocation in their lives, I think they take much solace from the many experiences. It is a balm. But I also think that the books serve for people who don't have that family experience of empathy, and empathy has never been more important, as Hamid says. And just going back to silence, the thing is, when people don't feel that they belong or can articulate it, and we're talking about things that are quite intangible, it's a longing for a homeland, it's loss, it's not feeling you're here or you're there. If you write the word down, even if you don't belong, the word belongs on the piece of paper, and that really matters. And then that book is passed from one hand to another, and it then becomes this vessel of migration. And that's what you've done. And I'm so happy that your exhibition will end up in Mosul, a place that has suffered so much, that has had its own experience of migration. And, you know, the hands there will touch all these many books and see so many things in it from their own perspective.
To hear that, I mean, there's so many questions coming in, but there's a very key question which keeps coming up, which is, do you write out of reflection or necessity? So, as a writer, what's going on about this particular moment in history? Elif, I'm looking at you for this for a second. This is a very particular moment. It's a very polarized moment. It's a very, many ways, as Kavita has been saying, a very toxic moment, where we're being asked all the time to turn back those people who are trying to get here. We're being told that we have to be British in a very particular way. Necessity, reflection, how do you actually write this moment now?
And especially when this moment is constantly changing and everything is shifting and nothing feels solid anymore, how do we respond? And I think that is the question we need to keep asking ourselves. Of course, I love that essay by Doris Lessing when she talks about literature and says that literature is analysis after the events. You need some time to pass by so that as a writer you can process, digest, and then in retrospect write about the events. I understand that aspect of literature, but I also think at a time like this, maybe literature has to become analysis during the event. Because when so much is happening so fast, we feel, more and more of us feel the maybe need to respond in any way we can, sometimes maybe through activism, sometimes through a poem, sometimes in a novel. But we are also children of this era. We're not disconnected. To me, that is very important. If I may add this, I think we need to bear in mind that all of the darkest chapters in history that we have been talking about so far, they did not start with concentration camps. It didn't start with people putting a cross sign on the doors of their neighbors because the color of their skin was different, because their ethnic origin was different. All of that happened later. It came later on. I think it started with words. It started with seemingly innocent jokes, the way language has been distorted, and how the other has been dehumanized, how others have been treated as if they were vermin, infesting countries. So we need to be very careful about how language can lead to systematic discrimination and even darker things in the next stages. And therefore, I think the resistance to dehumanization also needs to start with words and with stories.
I absolutely, and I think that, you know, on the walls of the library are written the words of Heinrich Heine, where he 200 years ago, where he says, where they burn books, then in the end they will burn humans. By which he means not just the burning of books, but actually that extraordinary way of infecting language against other people, of removing their particularity, removing a sense of them, of people with agency, and saying that they are actually not welcome within the communities we have. So when you burn books, you also burn humans, says Heine. But you're absolutely right, that attentiveness to the texture of language now is more vital than ever. Still many more questions coming in. I think we probably have time for just one more question, I'm afraid, which is someone who is talking, was very interested, Kavita, by the experience of exile being something inherited, where the children of those who are forced into exile respond to its consequences. Do you feel this inherited experience can be a rich theme for writers? Well, that's a question. For you, Kavita, it's certainly been a question for me too.
I absolutely do, and I think I'm second generation. And what I would say is that when you have a parent or grandparent who has lived through exile, and you have seen etched in them what that does, you feel a sense of fragility, I would say. Now, what I don't know is how many generations that fragility carries on. And what I mean fragility is you realize that my tie to this country is my parents. They came here. They had a choice. They could go back. I have nowhere to go back to. This is it. And yet the political environment will sometimes tell you that you don't belong. And so I'm sure I'm not alone. I have this imaginary suitcase that lives above my wardrobe, and sometimes I wonder if I had to go quickly, what would I take? And I know that that's not just a child of partition. I think that many other people feel that. And so I think, yes, in that space there is, you know, a huge amount of vulnerability, but also creativity, and yeah, I think that that I am attuned very strongly to a sense of otherness. And it might not be against South Asians, but when it's something like the Windrush or anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, I feel that very profoundly. So I think there is a universality of that experience for second and third generation. Beyond that, I don't know. Maybe beyond that, you feel that you belong. Who knows?
I mean, it's so interesting. I mean, I think we keep coming back to empathy, and the usage that empathy at its core is something that great literature, great storytelling, allows us to tune in, to listen more carefully, more attentively, and to learn. And it's an attentiveness that is about the present day. It's also an attentiveness to all those plural histories that you all three of you bring with you, whether it's from Central Asia, whether it's from the Balkans, whether it's from South Asia, wherever it is, those tuning into those particular narratives and allowing them the space to flourish and grow and to talk about things that really matter. Empathy, absolutely. Can we end on anger, please? We have almost no time. But when I read your book, Elif, and I got to your wonderful quotation from Toni Morrison, patron saint for many of us, I get angry about things, then go and work. I wondered what our work is. What is our work? Elif, and then Hamid, and then Kavita, and then we say goodbye. So Elif first.
Yeah, and I think it's understandable that we feel anger. We also feel sometimes confusion, bewilderment, maybe angst, like an existential angst. All of that, I believe, it's very normal. In other words, it's okay not to feel okay at this moment in time when the world is facing so many challenges and when our planet is burning. But what do we do with our anger? What do we do with our anxiety is the main question. So what's the next stage? Can we turn it into something more constructive, something more positive for ourselves individually, but also for the societies we live in? And I think our work is to connect, because what is dangerous is the lack of all emotions. In other words, numbness. If we become numb, if we become desensitized, disconnected, indifferent to each other's pain, indifferent to each other's stories, then terrible things can happen in the world. If we stop caring about what's going on. So I think our job is to punch holes in these walls of numbness and indifference that are being woven around us.
That's marvelous. Hamid, what's our
I said
work?
about the sort of, fighting prejudices as one of the sort of, functions of the literature. And just to end on the light note, I'll just quote one joke, about Hoja Nasreddin. So once his wife washed his gown and hanged it in the courtyard, and during the night there was some noise, and Hoja Nasreddin immediately jumped and took his rifle and shot, at the gown, and when realized that he shot his gown, he said, thank God, that I wasn't in this gown, So we have to deal with our prejudices like the Hoja Nasreddin dealt with his gown.
I love it. I love it. That's perfect. And Kavita, finally, our work.
I want to end on a high here and say and go back to messiness. And I think that what your books are a testament to, and our lives are a testament to, is messiness. And of course it is painful and the experiences are, but actually out of messiness comes great creativity and endurance and survival. And I think that that's what we have to remember, and that's what those books are testament to. And this is a difficult moment in time, but it will pass.
It will pass, and we have passed, because actually we have run out of time. But thank you. Please, I just have to wrap up to say a huge thank you to the British Museum. Please think of donating and supporting the British Museum in any way that you can. A huge thank you to PEN, who support writers in the most difficult circumstances possible. Please look them up online and support them too. If you're interested in the Library of Exile, please book if you can and go and see it in the British Museum, but we're also online. We have a catalogue. Suggest all the books that aren't yet in the library, and they will find a place in our online Library of Exile. The catalogue for this beautiful exhibition is also online too. There are more events ahead of us with other writers, so please stay tuned for that. But a huge thank you, a special thank you to these three wonderful, wonderful friends and writers for sharing yourselves so deeply, funnily, cogently, angrily, empathetically, lucidly. My God, honestly, if I'm going to be locked up in any library, I hope it's with you three. And thank you so much, everyone who's been with us this afternoon. I do hope you stay well and stay reading, and see you soon. Thank you. Goodbye.